There is a particular kind of stillness that has nothing to do with peace. You know the one. The night is quiet. The room is dark. The day is finished. And yet, something in you is still running, still circling, still reviewing, still preparing for a conversation that may never happen, still drafting a version of your life that you have not yet started living. You are not anxious, exactly, not sad, not even really awake. You are just thinking again. This is where we begin tonight. Not with a solution, not with a method, but with recognition. Because if your mind is the kind that moves very fast and goes almost nowhere, you are not broken. You are not lazy. You are not weak. You are doing something that has a name. And tonight, a man who spent his entire life mapping the hidden rooms of the human mind is going to sit with us in that restlessness. His name was Carl Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist who lived from 1875 to 1961. He was also, by his own account, someone who thought too much, dreamed too vividly, and spent decades learning why the very intelligence we trust to guide us can become the thing that holds us still. Jung spent the first part of his career as a student of Sigmund Freud, working alongside the most famous mind in psychology, absorbing his ideas, building on them. And then, in 1912, everything between them fell apart. A professional rupture, a personal loss, a silence where a great friendship used to be. And in that silence, Jung did not immediately begin again. He did not start fresh with clarity and purpose. He stopped. He stayed still. He circled. For 3 years, he wrote almost nothing of consequence. He drifted through his own interior like a man walking in fog, unsure of the ground. And it was from that stillness, that painful, circling stillness, that his greatest work eventually came. There is something in that. Tonight we are going to spend a long, quiet time with Jung's ideas about why the mind chooses thought over action. Why the very part of us that is most intelligent can become the part most committed to keeping us exactly where we are. Why overthinking is not a failure of willpower or focus, but something more interesting and, in its way, more understandable than that. There are 2 kinds of thinking, and one of them has almost nothing to do with solving anything. We will come to that. For now, let your body settle. Feel the surface beneath you. The weight of your own stillness. You do not need to do anything tonight. You do not need to arrive anywhere. You only need to listen. And in listening, something may loosen that has been held tight for a very long time. Let your jaw relax. Let your hands open. Here is the first thing worth knowing about this particular kind of restlessness. It is not random. It is not simply the mind misbehaving or failing to settle. This specific quality of circling, the thought that returns to the same material at the same hour with the same inconclusive result, has a structure. It follows a logic. And that logic, when it is finally understood, changes everything about how it feels. We will spend this entire long night following that logic all the way to its source, not to defeat it, not to replace it with something more productive, to understand it, to see it clearly, in the same way you might finally turn on a light in a room you have been navigating by feel for years. The understanding itself is a form of relief. Jung knew this. He spent his life on precisely this kind of understanding, not the kind that turns itself into systems or techniques, but the kind that simply lets you see what has always been there. And seeing, as we will discover, is where the loosening begins. Jung once wrote that what we refuse to face in ourselves does not disappear, it goes underground. It moves in the dark and shapes our lives from a place we cannot see. Tonight, we bring a light, not to fix, not to fix, just to see. And seeing, as Jung knew better than almost anyone, is where everything else begins. Chapter 2, Overthinking as Protection. Before we can understand what overthinking costs us, we need to understand what it gives us. Because it gives us something. If it did not, we would not keep doing it. Think about that for a moment. Every pattern that persists in the human mind persists because, at some level, it is working. It is meeting a need. It is solving a problem, even if the solution has become more painful than the original problem it was designed to address. Jung believed this deeply. He believed that the psyche does nothing without purpose. Every symptom, every defense, every strange loop of thought that traps us, each one was once an answer to something. The question is, what was overthinking originally answering? Here is what it protects you from. Overthinking protects you from the moment of action, from the instant when thought ends and reality begins, from the gap between imagining a thing and actually doing it, that terrifying, irreversible gap where the comfortable world of possibility closes behind you and something real starts. As long as you are thinking, nothing is settled. And as long as nothing is settled, nothing can go wrong. The plan cannot fail while it is still a plan. The relationship cannot disappoint while it is still a hope. The project cannot be rejected while it is still an idea living safely inside your head. The psyche, as Jung mapped it, is not irrational. It is perfectly rational given what it is afraid of. And somewhere in you, somewhere old and learned and very patient, is a part that is deeply afraid of what happens after you stop thinking and start moving. This is not weakness. This is not laziness. This is the mind doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect the self from perceived threat. The threat here just happens to be your own future. There is a story from a quiet Tuesday afternoon. A man sits at his desk with a document open on his screen. The document is the beginning of something he has wanted to do for almost 2 years. The cursor blinks. He reads the first line again. He edits a word. He reads it again. He opens a new tab to research something. Then another tab. Then he checks his email. Not because he is avoiding the work, he tells himself, because he wants to get it right, because he is preparing, because he will start properly once he has gathered a little more information. An hour passes. The document is still one paragraph long. He closes the laptop, feeling vaguely ashamed but unable to name exactly why. The shame is important. We will come back to it. For now, notice what happened in that hour. The man was not idle. His mind was very busy. He was collecting, organizing, preparing, all of which feel like progress. All of which have the texture of working without the exposure of actually beginning. Jung would call this a protection, a sophisticated, intelligent, exhausting protection. The body knows this loop. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Notice if there is any tension you have been carrying that belongs to that same loop, the circling, the gathering, the almost but not quite. You do not need to do anything about it right now. Just notice. Because the first thing Jung asks of us is not action, it is awareness. And awareness begins in the body, not in the mind that has been spinning too fast to feel anything clearly. The mind that overthinks is not your enemy. It is a very tired friend who has been working too hard and too long at a job that was never really theirs to do. And here is the thing that quiets. Understanding that job, understanding why the mind took it on in the first place, is the beginning of letting it put the work down. Chapter 3. The ego avoids risk. Jung divided the psyche into layers. At the surface, the part of you that faces the world makes decisions, forms sentences, and introduces itself at parties. He called this the ego, not in the casual modern sense of arrogance or pride. The ego, for Jung, was simply the conscious self, the I that walks through the day. The ego is useful. It is organizing. Without it, there is no coherent person, no stable sense of who you are and how you navigate. But the ego has a limitation that Jung spent decades mapping. It needs to feel in control, not because it is vain or small, because it is by its very nature the part of the psyche that deals with survival. Its job is to manage reality, to predict what comes next, to plan, to protect. And anything that threatens its ability to manage and predict is registered at some very deep level as danger. Action threatens the ego. This sounds strange at first. Action is how we change our lives. Action is progress. Action is moving forward. But consider what action requires of the ego. It requires the ego to release its grip on the familiar, to step into a situation it cannot fully predict, to allow reality to respond to what we do, and reality, as everyone who has lived long enough knows, does not always respond the way we hoped. The ego would rather stay in the planning stage, where everything is still controllable, where outcomes are still theoretical, where the self cannot be surprised, cannot be diminished, cannot be proven wrong about itself. Overthinking, from this angle, is the ego's preferred method of staying in charge. As long as you are analyzing, you are still the one in control. The moment you act, you hand something over to the world. And the world is not known for being gentle with our expectations. There is a story about a man who spent 40 years as an engineer. He was very good at his work. He had a mind that moved in systems and sequences, that found comfort in problems that had correct answers. After he retired, he wanted to write. He had always wanted to write stories, reflections, things that mattered to him. He had notebooks going back 30 years. But every time he sat down, he found himself making outlines instead of prose, correcting the outline, restructuring the outline, building a system for what the writing would be before allowing himself to write a single, real sentence. 3 years after retiring, he had the most detailed outline of an unwritten book that anyone had ever not written. He had not been wasting time. Every element of the outline was real. Every refinement was genuine, but none of it was the book. And some part of him, the very intelligent, very motivated, very stuck part, had found each new structural question at precisely the right moment to prevent the act of beginning. This is what sophisticated avoidance looks like from the inside. It looks like diligence. He was not procrastinating in the ordinary sense. He was doing what his ego had learned to do over 4 decades, building a control system before committing to the unknown. The engineering mind had learned that you should not begin a project until the architecture is sound. It had carried that rule into a place where the rule could not apply, into writing, which is always uncertain, always partially uncontrolled, always a conversation with something you did not plan. His ego was protecting him from an outcome he could not predict. And the cost of that protection was 3 years of outlines. And the ego was not wrong to try. The mistake was not in the trying. The mistake was in believing that more control over the outline would eventually produce the courage to begin the book. That readiness was never going to arrive from outside. It was only ever available from inside the act of beginning. Just breathe for a moment. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. Jung would say that there is no shame in this. The ego is doing exactly what it was built to do. The question is whether you are willing to work with it gently, patiently, rather than against it. Something in you already knows what it wants. It has known for a while. The ego's job is not to decide that. The ego's job is to manage what happens when you follow it. The question is who has been in charge, and whether tonight, just for tonight, the part that knows can be heard a little more clearly. Chapter 4. Why action feels dangerous. There is a specific feeling that arrives just before you are about to do something that matters. Not anxiety exactly, not quite fear, something more like a narrowing, a pressure behind the sternum, a sudden awareness of everything that could go wrong. You have felt this. Most people feel it every time they move towards something real. Jung would say, this feeling is not a sign that you should stop. He would say it is a sign that you are close to something that matters to the unconscious. That the pressure is not warning, it is weight. The weight of what the moment actually means. But the conscious mind, the reasoning, protecting ego, interprets that weight differently. It says danger. It says wait. It says you are not ready. And because the feeling is genuinely unpleasant, and because the mind is very good at finding reasons that sound reasonable, we listen. There is a deeper structure here that Jung identified. He called it the principle of psychic resistance. Every movement toward growth, toward change, toward becoming more fully yourself generates an equal and opposite pullback toward the familiar. Not because growth is wrong, because the psyche, like any living system, resists disruption. The resistance is not evil. It is not even wrong, exactly. It is the organism protecting its current stability. The problem is that human beings can be stable in ways that slowly kill them. A person can be stable in their unhappiness, stable in their loneliness, stable in a career that has never suited them, a relationship that has never felt right, a life that has the shape of someone else's expectations. Stability, in these cases, is not safety. It is stagnation, dressed in comfortable clothes. And the mind that overthinks has become very skilled at making stagnation feel like prudence. Think about the decisions you have been circling this year. Not the small ones, what to eat, which route to take. The real ones. The ones that have been waiting. You have probably been circling them for months, maybe longer. And in that circling, you have gathered enormous amounts of information. You have read things, listened to things, you have talked to people and gotten their opinions and weighed one consideration against another. You have built, in the mansion of your mind, a very detailed case for every possible outcome. And still, you have not moved, because more information was never what was needed. What was needed was something that information cannot provide. Courage is not a thought. It is not an absence of fear. It is not even a decision in the way we usually mean that word. It is a physical act, a step, a word spoken before you are ready to speak it. And the mind that has learned to substitute analysis for that step has learned the most elegant form of self-protection there is. Let your breath slow for a moment. Feel the air moving in and out without any effort. There is a story from 1913 that matters here. Carl Jung, at the height of his career, well-published, well-respected, one of the most promising minds in European psychiatry, sat alone in his study and heard a voice, or what felt like a voice. It was not a hallucination. It was more like a thought arriving with unusual force and clarity. The thought said, "What if everything you have built is nothing but a mass of fantasy?" Jung's professional reputation was at stake. His theoretical work was in question. His relationship with Freud had broken apart. And now, from somewhere inside himself, came a voice challenging the entire architecture of his understanding. He could have argued with the voice. He could have built a careful intellectual case for why the voice was wrong. He could have spent the next 10 years thinking about what the voice meant. Instead, he started writing, not carefully, not with a plan, just writing, dreams, visions, fragments of interior experience into what would eventually become the Red Book, a document he showed almost no one for the next 50 years. He acted before he understood what he was doing. And from that action, that terrifying, unsupported, uncertain action, came some of the most original psychological thinking of the 20th century. Action does not wait for readiness. Readiness, Jung knew, is often another word for never. Chapter 5, The Shadow of Hesitation. Jung had a concept that has filtered into modern culture in strange, sometimes distorted ways. He called it the shadow. In popular understanding, the shadow is the dark side, the dangerous impulses, the violent thoughts, the parts of yourself you are ashamed of and would prefer not to acknowledge. That is part of it. But Jung's actual conception was considerably larger and considerably more interesting. The shadow, for Jung, is everything the ego has refused to be. Everything the conscious self has decided does not belong to it, has pushed aside, suppressed, buried. Not only the dark things, also the bright things. The longing that feels too vulnerable to name. The talent that feels too exposed to use. The desire that feels too large to admit to. The shadow contains everything you have told yourself you are not. And here is where it connects to hesitation. When you stand at the edge of a real change in your life, when you are close to applying for the thing, writing the message, making the call, beginning the project, what stops you is often not simple fear of failure. What stops you is often something in the shadow, a belief about yourself that you have never said out loud, a story you inherited from someone else and made your own without ever examining it. A message from childhood that arrived so quietly, so many times, that it simply became part of the furniture of your interior. Messages like, people like you do not succeed at things like that. Or, wanting too much is dangerous. Or, if you try and fail, you will have nothing left to protect yourself with. These are shadow contents, not because they are evil, because they are hidden, because they operate in the dark, underneath the language of reason, shaping the very questions you allow yourself to ask. The person who overthinks often has a shadow that is very loud on the inside and very silent on the outside. They think endlessly, but the thinking never quite reaches the actual fear. Because the actual fear is in the shadow, and the shadow is by definition the part of the mind that conscious thought cannot quite touch. There is a garden in this image. Imagine a beautiful, well-tended garden. Every section maintained, watered, considered. And in one corner, almost out of sight, a section that has been left to grow wild, overgrown, dark. The gardener tells themselves they will get to it eventually. They never do. They tend every other part with devotion and leave that corner alone. The weeds in that corner grow taller every year. And in the tallest weeds, if you could bring yourself to look, are flowers. plants that seeded themselves when no one was watching, in the dark and the rich neglect, that are unlike anything in the rest of the garden. Jung believed that the shadow contains not just your wounds, but your unrealized gifts. The hesitation that circles you at night is not only protecting you from failure, it is also sometimes protecting you from the person you might become if you stopped circling. That is the quieter fear, the one beneath the other fears. Let your shoulders settle. And here is the thing worth holding before we move on. Jung did not say the shadow should be eliminated. He said it should be integrated, brought into relationship with the conscious self, not dominated, not suppressed further, not acted out blindly. Known. The first step toward anything real is knowing what you are actually afraid of, not the surface fear, the one beneath it. We are getting closer. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we move on. The shadow does not announce itself. That is its defining quality. It does not arrive wearing a sign that says, "Here is the fear you have refused to name." It arrives as apparently reasonable hesitation, as sensible caution, as the voice that sounds most like your own best judgment. This is why shadow work is slow and requires patience. You are not looking for something strange and foreign. You are looking for something that feels entirely like you, so thoroughly like you that you would not think to question it. And the specific shadow material we are tracking tonight, the part of you that has learned to protect itself by not completing the attempt, will feel, when you encounter it directly, like wisdom, like maturity, like the voice of experience. The test is the fruit it bears. A fear that consistently produces the same stillness year after year is not wisdom. Wisdom moves. Wisdom changes as circumstances change, as you change, as the information available to you changes. Fear dressed as wisdom repeats. Notice what in your life has been repeating. That is the shadow's address. Chapter 6. Anxiety beneath inaction. There is a particular time of night when the mind is at its most honest. Most people know this time intimately. It arrives somewhere between late and very late, when the last distractions have stopped working and the last tasks of the day have run out and the quiet finally becomes complete. And in that quiet, something rises. Not peace, not rest. A low, persistent hum of unease that is hard to locate and harder to name. You might call it anxiety. But that word is too clinical, too diagnostic, too much like something that belongs in a medical file rather than in the ordinary middle of a human life. This feeling, this hum, this low pressure in the chest is what Jung might call the voice of the undone. It is the emotional residue of everything you have been circling but not completing. Everything you have known at some level that you need to move toward and have not moved toward. Not today. Not this week. Perhaps not this year. The body keeps its own account, and the account it keeps is remarkably precise. It does not record only the big things, the obvious stresses, the known losses. It records the accumulation of small suppressions. The moment you noticed something needed to change and looked away, the feeling that arrived and was filed under later, the word that wanted to be said and was reorganized into something safer. Every small suppression costs something. Not much in the moment, essentially nothing. But compounded over years, over decades of small filed aways and later addressed and not quite now, the accumulated cost becomes the quality of the days. The tiredness that sleep does not fix. The flatness underneath the ordinary satisfactions. The body does not complain loudly about small suppressions. It just becomes incrementally heavier. And at night, when the motion stops and the distractions run out and the body finally stops moving, the heaviness is simply there, honest, unmistakable. You can talk yourself out of the awareness during the day. There are meetings and messages and 100 small tasks that need your attention. The momentum of ordinary life can carry you through a long time without having to sit with the hum. But at night, the carrying stops and the hum is there. Jung understood this. He wrote about the experience of what he called psychic tension, the accumulated pressure of the unlived. He observed that when people refused year after year to act on what they deeply knew they needed to do, the refusal did not simply disappear. It compounded. It built pressure in the psychological system the way steam builds in a closed vessel. Sometimes that pressure escapes sideways into irritability, into physical tightness, into arguments that seem to be about one thing but are really about something else entirely, into the restlessness you feel right before sleep, into the low-grade dissatisfaction that colors good days and ruins moderate ones. Think about someone you know, or perhaps yourself, who has been carrying a particular decision for years. Not the small decisions, the real ones. Whether to leave the job that has become a slow suffocation. Whether to say the thing that has been building between you and someone you love. Whether to begin the project that has been waiting on the shelf of your ambitions since before you can remember. The longer the delay, the heavier the carrying. And the carrying does not stay still. It moves through everything. It shows up in the way the body holds itself at the end of the day, in the tiredness that sleep does not fix. There are two kinds of tiredness. This is the second kind. Not the tiredness of the body that has worked hard and needs rest. It is honest and uncomplicated and responds to sleep with relief. This is something different. The tiredness of the self that has been bracing against the thing it has not done, bracing against the awareness that keeps trying to surface, bracing against its own unrealized life. Let your breath move freely for a moment. You do not need to solve anything right now. The decisions will still be there tomorrow. They have been patient this long. But notice, if you can, somewhere in your body where that bracing lives. The tight place, the held place, the part of you that has been clenched around something for so long that the clenching has become invisible, has become simply how things feel. That is where tonight begins to do its quiet work. Not by forcing anything open, by letting you notice, maybe for the first time in a long time, that something has been held there, and that you are the one holding it. This distinction is important. You are not the thing being held. You are the one doing the holding, which means the holding is, in some essential sense, a choice, one made so long ago from such a genuine need that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like simply how things are. But it is a choice, and choices can be revisited. Not tonight, necessarily. Not all at once, certainly. But in the accumulated small decisions of the days ahead, in the moment of noticing the loop, in the moment of asking the honest question, in the moment of taking the small step rather than filing it under some day, the holding can gradually become something else. Not releasing, not abandoning what was being protected, opening. The clenched hand that slowly unclenches is not empty. It is free. Everything it was holding is still there, but now held in the open palm rather than the closed fist. And there is an enormous difference between those two ways of carrying something. The closed fist cannot receive anything new. The open hand can, and that you are the one holding it. Chapter 7, The Fantasy of Readiness. Here is one of the most seductive ideas the mind ever invented. I will be ready soon. Not yet, but soon. Once the conditions are right, once I have learned a little more, once the timing is better, once the children are older, the debt is smaller, the season is different, the situation at work is clearer. Once I am more prepared. This story, the story of the approaching readiness, can last a lifetime. And people do let it last a lifetime. Not because they are foolish, not because they do not care about the thing they are waiting to be ready for, but because readiness is the most comfortable of all the reasons not to begin. It is not refusal. It is simply not yet. Jung had a name for the aggregate of everything that accumulates in this delay. He called it the unlived life. It is the body of experience, relationship, creation, and becoming that a person is capable of, that belongs to who they are at their deepest level, and that they do not allow themselves to enter. The unlived life is not always dramatic. It is not necessarily the abandoned career or the unspoken love. Sometimes it is much quieter than that. The letter you have never written to your father, even though you know somewhere that there are things that need to be said. The instrument in the corner of the room that you bought 4 years ago with genuine intention and have not touched in 3. The creative impulse that visits you at odd moments, in the shower, in the car, just before sleep, that you note and then file away under someday. Someday has a problem, someday is not on the calendar. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century mathematician and philosopher who spent long years of illness in a cold room writing some of the most penetrating observations about human behavior ever recorded, understood this particular trap. He wrote that nearly all of humanity's suffering could be traced to a single cause: our inability to sit quietly in a room. Not because stillness is wrong, because the inability to sit quietly signals an interior that has become too loud to face. And the cure for that loudness is not more preparation. The Fantasy of Readiness has a particular flavor. It feels responsible. It feels wise. It has the texture of maturity, because surely a mature person thinks before they act, prepares before they begin. And thinking and preparation are genuinely useful to a point. The point they become something else is the point at which more information would not actually change what you decide. When more planning would not actually improve the plan. When the only thing that additional preparation accomplishes is to postpone the moment when you have to find out what happens. You already know what you want to do. This is the part that is hardest to admit. Most people who are waiting to be ready already know what they would do if they were ready. The information is already in. The direction is already chosen, somewhere beneath the surface of all that circling. They are not waiting for clarity. They are waiting for certainty. And certainty, as every person who has lived long enough has discovered, is not something that life agrees to give in advance. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body. Jung wrote in his autobiography that the first act of his most productive years was not planned. It was almost an accident, a decision made before the deliberate mind could catch up with it. He began writing into the Red Book not because he was ready, because the alternative was to keep circling what he could not name. He acted without readiness. And the work that came from that act changed the entire landscape of how we understand the human interior. Readiness is a myth the mind offers when it wants to stay safe. The life you want is on the other side of the myth. Chapter 8. Thinking instead of living. There is a word for the kind of intelligence that turns in on itself. It is not quite the right word in English, but it points at something real. Rumination. The mind returning to the same material again and again, chewing on it, breaking it into smaller pieces, finding new angles on what has already been turned over 100 times. The word comes from the Latin for what cattle do when they redigest their food. There is no judgment in that, it is simply accurate. The mind in rumination is processing and reprocessing material that is not moving forward. That is circling in place. Jung observed that one of the most common presentations in his consulting room, one of the most common complaints of the modern psyche, was exactly this. Brilliant people, perceptive people, people with exceptional inner lives and considerable self-understanding who were somehow unable to translate any of it into movement. He called this a particular kind of introversion taken past its natural limit. Now, introversion itself is not a problem. Jung was one of the first to describe introversion as a genuine psychological orientation, not a deficiency. The introvert processes internally, thinks before acting, finds energy in solitude, not stimulation. But there is a point at which internal processing becomes its own destination, where the thinking is not preparation for something, it is the something, where introspection becomes a way of life rather than a tool for living. The person who lives almost entirely in their interior world is not experiencing life. They are experiencing their thoughts about life, and that is a very different thing. Imagine someone who has spent 20 years reading about travel, who owns dozens of beautiful books about places they have never been, who knows the best times to visit certain cities, the hidden streets most tourists miss, the history behind landmarks they have studied in photographs. They have never left the country where they were born. The knowledge is real. The love for those places is real. The curiosity is genuine. But they have been visiting a version of the world that only exists in their mind. Thinking about a thing and doing a thing use different parts of the self. They feel similar, particularly to a mind that has learned to make thinking feel very rich and full and satisfying. But they are not the same. Living, as Jung insisted over and over, requires encounter with something outside the self, with other people, with difficulty, with consequences, with the unpredictable response of the real world to your actual presence in it. The mind that stays inside itself is, in a real sense, never fully tested, never fully known, because we do not know who we are in the abstract. We know who we are by meeting what is actually there. Here is what that looks like from the outside. A woman who has been thinking about starting her own work for 9 years. She has files. She has research. She has spoken to people who have done similar things. She knows the landscape of the challenge she wants to enter better than most people who are already in it. And yet she has not started. She is not stupid. She is not lacking discipline. She has been, in her own way, completely dedicated to this project for nearly a decade. She has been dedicated to thinking about it. The gap between thinking about a life and living one is not measured in intelligence or information or passion. It is measured in a single act of doing the thing you know you need to do. Just breathe. Let the room be quiet around you. Jung's own life was not a story of perfect readiness and careful planning. It was a story of someone who kept encountering the edges of what he knew and stepping off them anyway, into the dark, into the uncertain, into the places where his careful professional mind could not protect him. He stepped, and the ground, not always, but often enough, held. Chapter 9. The Inner Critic Delays. There is a voice most overthinkers know very well. It arrives at specific moments. Just as you are about to begin something, just as a possibility is becoming real, just as the gap between thinking and doing is narrowing enough to cross. The voice says, "Not quite yet." It says, "You could do this better." It says, "Are you sure about this?" It says, "What will they think?" It says, "You have not thought this all the way through." Jung would call this, in its mild form, the critical faculty of the ego. In its more persistent, more disruptive form, he might point to what he called a complex, a cluster of emotionally charged thoughts and memories that organizes itself around a particular wound and speaks with remarkable authority. The inner critic is one of the most common complexes in the psyche, and it has an unusual relationship with delay. Most people experience the inner critic as a kind of quality control, a voice that is trying to protect them from embarrassment, from failure, from the judgment of others. And in small doses, with proper calibration, this is exactly what it does. The problem is that the critic, once installed and reinforced by years of self-doubt and perfectionism, does not know how to distinguish between protecting you and simply stopping you. It applies the same intensity of scrutiny to a small risk as to a large one. It responds to the possibility of being seen, really seen, with all your imperfections visible, with the same alarm it would apply to genuine danger. To the inner critic, being seen is genuine danger. And it applies this alarm to almost everything. The presentation at work, the email to someone who might judge the phrasing, the creative project, the honest conversation, the attempt at something new. All of these activate the same level of warning. Be careful, be less visible, be certain before proceeding. The result is a life that moves very carefully, very slowly, in very small circles that stay safely within the range of what is known and approved. This is a learned response. No one is born with a critic this severe. It develops over time, through experiences that taught a young person that certain kinds of mistakes were unacceptable, that certain kinds of failure were shameful, that approval was something to be earned through performance rather than given freely. Jung was deeply interested in how these early experiences organized themselves into permanent structures in the psyche. He called them father complexes, mother complexes, hero complexes, clusters of emotional memory that continue to act on the adult long after the original circumstances are gone. The person whose inner critic learned its lines from a parent who demanded perfection carries that parent into every project, every attempt, every moment of beginning. The parent is long gone or simply ordinary now, but the complex remains, still demanding, still withholding approval, still saying, "Not yet." Here is what this sounds like from the inside. A man in his mid-50s. He has wanted to return to school to study something that actually interests him for 7 years. Every time he considers registering, the critic is there. You are too old for this. People will wonder what you are doing. You should have done this decades ago. This is embarrassing. What if you fail? What if you cannot keep up? The voice sounds like wisdom. It uses the language of prudence and maturity. It makes the man feel that his hesitation is sensible, that he is simply being realistic. He has been being realistic for 7 years. Let your shoulders settle. Let the breath come freely. The inner critic delays because completing a thing makes it visible. And visible things can be judged. And the critic, more than anything, is afraid of judgment. because it learned a long time ago that judgment is dangerous. We do not argue with the critic. We do not try to silence it. We simply notice it. We say, "There you are," and then, gently, we take one step forward anyway. Chapter 10. Fear disguised as wisdom. This is perhaps the most elegant trap the mind sets for itself, because fear, when it learns to wear the right clothes, becomes almost indistinguishable from good judgment. It speaks in the language of responsibility. It sounds like care. It has the cadence of maturity, of experience, of someone who has learned from the past. And so we listen to it, we give it authority, we let it write the narrative of why we are waiting, why we are not moving, why now is not the right time. We call it wisdom. Jung was alert to this particular sleight of hand. He was interested in the way the psyche can construct the most sophisticated and apparently reasonable defenses against the very change it most needs. He wrote about the ego's remarkable talent for rationalization, for finding, after the fact, a perfectly intelligent-sounding reason for a decision that was made entirely from fear. The decision comes first, the reasoning comes after. This is deeply counterintuitive. We like to believe that we gather information, weigh it carefully, and arrive at a reasoned conclusion. Sometimes this is true, but very often, particularly around the decisions that carry the most emotional weight, the decision is made by the part of the mind that operates below language, by the part that learned its lessons before words were available, by the part that simply responds yes or no, toward or away, open or closed. And then the language comes to explain it. The reasoning that follows a fear-based decision sounds almost exactly like the reasoning that follows a wisdom-based one. This is what makes it so hard to distinguish. There is one test, though. A decision made from genuine wisdom tends to bring a sense of settling, even if the direction is difficult. A quiet recognition, yes, this is true, this is real, this is what needs to happen. A decision made from fear tends to bring continued circling, an uneasy sense that the reasoning does not quite reach the bottom of the question. More analysis needed, more time required. The feeling of having answered the question while somehow not having answered it. You know this feeling. Most of us have sat with it. The explanation that circles back around without ever quite landing. The impressive-sounding reasons that somehow need to keep being repeated. Genuine wisdom does not need to convince itself. It knows. Fear needs a very long argument. Picture someone sitting with a letter they need to send. Not a difficult letter, a real one. Words to someone who matters. The kind of letter that, once sent, cannot be unsent. The kind that makes you visible. Every time they sit down to write it, a careful and responsible-sounding voice explains why now is not the right moment. The person is probably busy. The tone isn't right yet. It has been so long that perhaps it would be strange to reach out now. Perhaps the gesture would be misunderstood. These are all, on the surface, reasonable considerations. They are also fear wearing a very convincing suit, and the letter does not get written. Let your breath be slow. Feel the room around you quiet and still. The test is this: not, is this reason good enough, but is this reason actually the reason? When we ask that second question honestly, sitting with it in the body rather than analyzing it in the mind, the answer is usually already there. We have been waiting for the fear to become wisdom. It was always just fear. And fear, Jung teaches us, is not a stop sign. It is a compass pointing toward exactly where we need to go. Chapter 11. Self-Sabotage in Silence. Self-sabotage does not always announce itself. It rarely looks like destruction. It rarely feels like giving up. Often it looks remarkably like effort. The person who prepares obsessively but never begins. The person who begins but never quite finishes. The person who finishes but never shows anyone. The person who shows someone but immediately dismisses the work before anyone else can. These are all forms of self-sabotage. Quiet ones. The ones that do not look like failure from the outside because they never produce a visible result that can be assessed as failure. This is the genius of silent self-sabotage. It happens in the space before the outcome. It is a preemptive strike. If you never fully begin, you never fully fail. If you never fully finish, the work retains its theoretical perfection. If you never show anyone, the response, positive or negative, never arrives to disturb your equilibrium. The work lives forever in the protected space of the unfinished. And this protected space is not an unhappy place. Inside the unfinished thing, potential remains intact. The book that is never written is always the best possible version of itself. The conversation never started, never went wrong. The project never submitted, was never rejected. There is a kind of comfort available in the perpetually unfinished that the completed thing can never offer. The completed thing is limited. It is what it is. It has edges and imperfections and responses from the world that may not match what was imagined. The unfinished thing is still everything. This is the seduction that keeps the pattern in place. And naming it, really seeing it for what it is, rather than experiencing it as simply not ready yet, begins to loosen its hold. Jung observed that the psyche has a remarkable talent for self-preservation that sometimes masquerades as self-defeat. He was fascinated by the ways people manage to simultaneously want something and prevent themselves from having it. His explanation connected to the concept of the complex we touched on earlier. A complex does not simply offer bad advice. It actively intervenes. It shapes behavior from the inside, often without the conscious self being aware of what is happening. The complex operates like a splinter program in the psyche, running in the background, influencing outcomes, steering events according to its own agenda. The agenda of the complex formed around fear of failure is never produce a result that can be assessed as failure. The strategy, make sure nothing reaches completion. It is elegant in a painful way, because the person enacting this strategy is not lazy. They are often working intensely. They are just working in a direction that looks like progress, but is actually a very sophisticated loop. Think about someone drafting the same document for the 6th time. Not because it is bad, because a 6th draft means they are still drafting, not submitting. The moment they submit, they are subject to the world's response. The 6th draft is, in the most honest analysis, not a better document. It is a deferral of that moment. There is no shame in recognizing this pattern. Most people who live inside it have it because they once tried, and the result was painful enough that some very deep part of the psyche decided, we will not allow that particular pain again. We will find another way. The other way turned out to be staying in motion without arriving. Just breathe. Let the air move slowly. Here is the thing about Jung's approach to these patterns. He did not believe that understanding them was enough to dissolve them. He believed that understanding was the beginning. That the light of consciousness brought to bear on an unconscious pattern begins the process of loosening it. You cannot see in the dark. But once you turn a light on, the room does not immediately transform. The light simply lets you see what was always there. And seeing clearly, seeing the pattern for what it is, without the disguise it usually wears, is the first thing the pattern cannot survive. Because the pattern depends on invisibility. If your mind has been drifting through this long night, come back gently now. We are approaching the part where things begin to turn. The moment you see it clearly, you have already changed your relationship to it. And changing your relationship to something is always the first step toward changing where it leads. Chapter 12. The Persona of Competence. Jung introduced a concept he called the persona, from the Latin word for mask, specifically the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre. The persona is the social face, the presentation we build for the world's approval, the version of ourselves that knows how to perform competence, warmth, confidence, stability, whatever the particular role we inhabit requires. Every person has one. Every person needs one. There is nothing inherently false about a persona. It is a necessary adaptation to social reality. We cannot walk through the world with all of our uncertainty and anxiety and unfinished interior on permanent display. But the persona becomes a problem when it is mistaken for the whole self. And there is a particular kind of persona that is especially common among people who overthink and underact. The persona of the extremely capable, highly intelligent, deeply thoughtful person who has not yet acted. This persona is actually quite effective. It tends to receive a great deal of respect and admiration. The person who knows a great deal, who thinks carefully, who always has a nuanced take on any situation, this person is valued, consulted, regarded as serious and substantive. The persona provides, in other words, the social rewards that action would otherwise generate. But without the exposure of action, the quietly competent thinker receives the credit for what they could do without ever having to find out what they actually do. The idea of the person, articulate, knowledgeable, considered, is endorsed by everyone around them. The reality of the person, uncertain, afraid, struggling to begin, stays safely hidden. This is not manipulation. Most people wearing this persona are not consciously aware of it. They have simply discovered, often early in life, that being the smartest person in the room is both safer and more comfortable than being the person taking the biggest risk in the room. Smart is praised. Risk-taking is terrifying. And so the intelligence turns inward. It deepens. It grows more elaborate. And the persona of the brilliant but waiting person becomes, over time, more and more precisely tailored to avoid the one thing that would test it. The actual attempt. There is something almost architectural about this. The persona of the competent, thoughtful, almost but not quite begun person has load-bearing walls. Remove it or expose it, and the whole structure must be rebuilt, which means a period of uncomfortable transition in which the person is neither the person they were presenting as nor the person they are still becoming. That transition period is real, and it is frightening, and the psyche's avoidance of it is not irrational. But a building whose walls are all load-bearing, where nothing can be touched without risking collapse, that is not a well-designed building. That is a building that cannot be renovated, cannot grow beyond what it already is. The persona that is entirely load-bearing has the same problem. Nothing can change. Let your jaw soften. There is a moment in the therapy room, Jung described variations of it many times, when a highly intelligent patient will offer a beautifully articulate analysis of their own psychological pattern. Every piece of the puzzle named and placed with remarkable clarity, and then they will ask with genuine puzzlement, "So, why can't I change?" The answer Jung often offered was quietly startling. Because you have used your understanding of the problem to replace the work of changing it. Insight is not transformation. Understanding is not action. The persona of the deep, self-aware person can become the most sophisticated trap of all, because it allows you to live entirely in the analysis and call it growth. The persona that keeps you safe also keeps you still. And the self that lives behind the persona, quieter, less polished, more afraid, more real, is the self that actually needs to take the first step. That self is not the one who knows all the right things. It is the one who acts before knowing. Chapter 13, Dreams of Unlived Life. There is a phrase that deserves its own quiet attention. The unlived life. Jung used it differently in different contexts, but the core of what he meant was this: the sum of what a person is capable of becoming, the experiences and relationships and forms of expression that belong to who they most deeply are that do not happen, that get deferred, suppressed, postponed, or simply never reached. The unlived life is not dramatic, usually. It is not necessarily the abandoned calling or the life-altering choice refused. Often, it is much quieter than that. It is the conversation that would have shifted everything, never started because the moment never seemed right. The friendship that could have become a great one, allowed to fade because reaching out felt awkward. The version of yourself that would have emerged if you had followed a particular thread of interest or taken a particular risk or said the particular thing you had decided not to say. Jung believed that the unlived life does not simply sit quietly and wait. It makes itself known. It enters dreams. It appears as vague dissatisfaction on days that should feel fine. It shows up as the persistent sense that something important is missing, even when every external measure says your life is going well. He also believed something more provocative, that the unlived life has an energy of its own, that what you refuse to live consciously tends to find its way into your experience in less comfortable forms. The person who refuses to express their anger directly begins to encounter an inexplicable series of passive confrontations. The person who refuses to acknowledge their loneliness begins to feel it most acutely in the middle of their fullest social situations. The unlived life insists on being felt even when it cannot be lived. Think about someone in their early 60s. They have, by any external measure, done well. A career that was not passionate but was solid and respected. A family that loves them. A home that is comfortable. Days that are full enough. And yet, every few months, usually at night, usually in the quiet that arrives when the television is finally off and the house is sleeping, a feeling arrives that has no name. It is not grief, exactly. Not regret, exactly. It is more like the sensation of standing in front of a door that you know leads somewhere interesting, somewhere that would change you, and realizing that you have been standing there for 20 years, still standing, still not opening it. The unlived life is that door. Let your breath find its natural rhythm. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Here is the thing Jung would want you to know, sitting with this feeling tonight. The door does not have an expiration date. The unlived life is not a museum of what might have been. It is not a list of failures to grieve. It is living. It is present. It is available. It is waiting with a patience that outlasts the ego's fear. This is perhaps the most quietly important thing to understand about the unlived life. It is not a judgment. It does not stand across from you in accusation, holding a list of everything you failed to do. It is simply what is still available, what is still real, what has survived all the years of waiting with its essential nature intact. The pianist who stopped playing at 32 can sit down at a piano at 58. The hands will remember. The music will require patience to return. But the desire, the love for it, the specific quality of feeling that music produces in that particular person, none of that has expired. Unlived lives are not cancelled by delay. They wait in the body as much as in the mind. In the specific ache you feel when you watch someone doing the thing you have not yet allowed yourself to do. In the quality of attention you give to particular subjects, particular people, particular conversations about particular possibilities. The attention you give is the unlived life pointing at itself, saying, "Here, I am still here." And the step toward it, the first real unrehearsed step, does not have to be large. It only has to be honest. That is all the unlived life has ever asked of you. One honest step. Chapter 14. Perfectionism and Paralysis. Perfectionism is such a familiar word that we have almost stopped thinking about what it actually describes. We use it as a confession of virtue. "I am a perfectionist," people say, often with a small apologetic smile, as if to say, "I care too much. I hold myself to too high a standard. I cannot let imperfect work leave my hands." This is the persona of perfectionism, and it is, as Jung would note, the part of the truth that flatters. The other part is less comfortable. Perfectionism is also a defense, a very sophisticated, very effective defense against the risk of being evaluated. If perfect is the only acceptable outcome, and perfect is never achievable, then the work will never be submitted to judgment. The attempt will never be made, or will be made in perpetual draft form, circling toward a standard that recedes as you approach it. The perfectionist, in this analysis, is not someone who produces exceptionally high-quality work. They are someone who has identified an impossible standard as the condition for beginning, or the condition for finishing, or the condition for showing what they have made. The standard ensures the work remains inside, where it cannot be criticized because it does not yet fully exist. This is not cynical. This is not a critique of people who care deeply about quality. Quality matters. Excellence is worth pursuing. The distinction is this: a person pursuing excellence can submit imperfect work with the understanding that all work is imperfect, that imperfect work can still be valuable, that putting something into the world and finding out how it lands is part of the creative and professional process. A perfectionist cannot submit imperfect work because submission is not the point. Perfection is the point. And the pursuit of perfection means the work never actually meets the world. Jung saw perfectionism as one of the ego's most elaborate constructions. A fortress built entirely of standards, high gleaming walls that keep the self protected inside and keep the world's response safely outside. Inside the fortress, the self remains perfect in possibility, uncriticized, untested, intact. Outside the fortress, the actual life that is not happening. There is an image from Japan that matters here. The Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi holds that imperfection is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the mark of the real, the lived, the genuine. The crack in the bowl filled with gold. the irregular glaze, the shape that only human hands could make. These are not shortcomings. They are the traces of existence. The flawless bowl is indistinguishable from a copy. The imperfect one is unique. It has been somewhere, it has been held. The work that carries the marks of being made is the work that is real. The perfect work, still unbegun inside the mind of the perfectionist, has no marks at all, because it has not been anywhere, because it has not been held. Let your breath slow. Notice the air. There is something of you that already knows this, that already senses that the imperfect version of the thing you want to make is more valuable in every way that matters than the perfect version you have been protecting in the imagination. The imperfect version is real. This is a distinction worth sitting with, because it challenges something very deep in how most of us have been taught to value our own work. We were taught in school mostly, and then confirmed in many workplaces, that the difference between acceptable and unacceptable was the gap between correct and incorrect, between finished and unfinished, between the standard and the performance. But the world of actual human creation does not work by those rules. A painting that took 6 months of struggle carries something that a technically perfect painting produced in a day cannot. The struggle is in it. The specific history of a person making something real is present in the irregularity, the revision, the place where the brush changed direction. What you have made bears the marks of who you are. And who you are is what someone, somewhere, is waiting to encounter. Not the perfected version. You. And realness is what the world is waiting for. Chapter 15. The Comfort of Possibility. There is a pleasure in the unbegun. This is something that is rarely named, but almost universally felt. Before you begin a thing, it contains everything. It has not been shaped by the compromises of execution, the limitations of your actual skills, the unpredictability of real circumstances. It exists in the mind as what it could be in its best possible form. It is pure potential. And potential is, in a very real sense, the most comfortable state available to the human mind. In potential, you are always talented enough. The conditions are always theoretically right. The outcome is always still open. You can imagine the version where it works perfectly and live inside that imagined version without ever having to test whether reality agrees. This is not laziness. It is something more interesting. It is the discovery, conscious or not, that the pleasure of imagining exceeds the pleasure of doing. Jung understood this in terms of what he called libido, not in the narrowly sexual sense that Freud used it, but in the broader sense of psychic energy, vital force, the energy that moves toward life. When psychic energy is not flowing into actual life, into real encounters, real acts, real consequences, it flows somewhere else. It flows into fantasy, into imagination, into the elaborately detailed mental rehearsal of experiences that are not happening. And fantasy can be rich, can be absorbing, can feel, in the moment, almost as satisfying as the real thing. This is part of why overthinking is so seductive. The person who has been thinking about writing a book for 5 years has, in their mind, written many books. Different versions, different approaches, different responses from imagined readers. They have lived inside the experience of the book in a way that no actual reader will ever be able to, because they have had complete authorship over the imagined response. In the imagination, the book is always exactly what it needed to be. The real book will not be. The real book will be flawed and partial and surprising and disappointing in some ways and better than expected in others. It will be responded to in ways that cannot be predicted. It will become a real thing, with all the awkwardness and limitation and unexpected vitality that real things carry. That loss of control, that surrender of the perfect imagined version to the imperfect real one, is part of what makes beginning so genuinely difficult. You are not just risking failure when you begin, you are sacrificing the perfect version of the thing that exists in your mind. And that sacrifice is real. It is a form of grief. Just breathe. Feel the weight of your arms resting where they are. Here is what Jung would say about the comfort of possibility. The psychic energy held in the imagination is not wasted, but it is not living. It is, he used this word, arrested, stopped at a stage of development before the engagement with reality that makes experience real. And the energy of a life, accumulated in the imagination year after year, decade after decade, that energy does not remain still. It curdles, it grows heavy. It becomes the source of that low hum we described earlier, the unease, the restlessness, the sense of something missed that follows good days into bed. The comfort of possibility is real, but it comes at a cost that compounds over time. And the longer we live inside the possible rather than the actual, the heavier that cost becomes. This is the thing most people sense but cannot quite name. That the dream protected in the imagination becomes, over years, a kind of accusation. Every year that passes is another year in which the imagined version is held against the unlived actual version. The dream does not fade with time. It gets louder. Not because life has failed to provide opportunities, but because the psyche keeps sending them and something keeps redirecting them back into the imagination. Something is about to shift in what we understand about all of this. Stay with it. Chapter 16. Complexes that freeze us. Jung spent decades developing his theory of complexes. It is one of his most enduring contributions, and in many ways, the one most relevant to why intelligent people freeze. A complex in Jungian psychology is not merely a problem. It is a cluster of associated ideas, memories, and emotional reactions organized around a core emotional tone. They are formed through experience, often early experience, often in relationship with people who matter deeply, and they continue to operate long after the original situation is gone. Think of a complex as a knot in the psyche, a place where certain kinds of experience get tangled together and cannot move freely. The person who has a complex around authority formed perhaps through years of experience with a critical or unpredictable parent, does not simply have thoughts about authority figures. Their entire psychological state reorganizes around the encounter. The heartbeat changes, the posture changes, the vocabulary contracts. The confident adult becomes, for a moment, the uncertain child. The knot activates. This is not weakness. This is the psyche doing what it learned to do in conditions that genuinely required it. The problem is that the complex does not know time has passed. It responds to a present situation with the fear of a past one. For people who overthink, one of the most common complexes is organized around the wound of early criticism or early failure. Some experience, some series of experiences that taught a young mind. When you act, you may be hurt. When you show what you made, it may be taken apart. When you try, you may fail in a way that is visible and embarrassing and possibly permanent. And the complex, once established, does its job faithfully. Every time action is approaching, the complex activates. The emotional tone of those early experiences floods the present. The body responds as if the threat is real, and the mind, not knowing quite why it is suddenly reluctant, reaches for a rational explanation. Not ready yet. Not quite the right time. I need to think about this a little more. The complex is speaking, but it is speaking in the language of the intelligent adult, not the vulnerable child it is protecting. Here is how this feels from the inside. You are not a particularly anxious person in daily life. You manage responsibility. You handle complexity. You are respected by the people who work with you and trusted by the people who know you. And yet, there is one specific kind of situation, the presentation of your own work to someone whose opinion matters to you. The direct expression of a personal ambition, the moment when you claim something as yours, in which you suddenly feel much younger than you are. Uncertain, exposed, more fragile than the situation seems to warrant. This is the complex. It is not your general character. It is a specific activation in response to a specific kind of encounter. Let your breath come slowly. Let your shoulders drop. Jung's approach to complexes was not to eliminate them. He did not believe they could be removed any more than you could remove a scar by pretending the wound had not happened. He believed they could be known, and knowing them, recognizing the activation for what it is, seeing the child's fear inside the adult's reluctance, changes the relationship. The complex is still there, but you are no longer entirely inside it. You can see it. There is enormous power in this small shift. Because the complex operates on the assumption that you are identical with the fear, that the fear is the whole of you, that there is no part of you that is not afraid. The moment you observe the complex, even for a moment, even partially, you have demonstrated that the assumption is wrong. You are the observer, and the observer is not afraid. That observer has been there throughout everything we have discussed tonight. Watching, noticing, sometimes choosing, and sometimes not. It is the part of you that has been following this conversation, recognizing things in it. It is older and quieter and steadier than the complex, and it has been waiting for you to remember it was there. And seeing it from the outside, even briefly, creates the possibility of a different response. Not the response of the wounded child. The response of the adult who understands what is happening and acts anyway. Chapter 17. Childhood and Caution. The lessons we learned first are the ones that go deepest, not because we chose them, because we had no choice. A child has no alternative framework, no prior experience to check new information against. What a child is told about the world, what a child observes about what happens when they act, what a child learns about the consequences of being seen and wanting and reaching and failing, all of this becomes simply how things are. Not a belief, not an opinion. The ground itself, and the ground laid down in the first years of life, is the ground we stand on for the rest of it, unless, and this was Jung's great contribution, we bring it into consciousness. Some people learned very young that caution was the safest strategy available. Perhaps they had a parent who was unpredictable, who could be generous and warm one moment and critical, or withdrawn the next, with no clear rule governing which was coming. The safest response to that environment was to move carefully, to watch before acting, to think before speaking, to gauge the emotional temperature of the room before committing to anything visible. This is not a flaw in the child. It is intelligence. It is the most rational possible adaptation to an environment that rewarded carefulness and punished miscalculation. But the adaptation outlasts its usefulness. The person raised in that particular kind of uncertainty becomes, as an adult, someone who moves carefully in all environments, who watches before acting in situations that do not require watching, who gauges the emotional temperature of rooms that are entirely safe. The strategy that protected a child becomes the thing that prevents an adult from living at full capacity. Or perhaps the lesson was different. Perhaps caution was learned not from unpredictability, but from perfectionism, from a parent or teacher or environment that rewarded excellence and was visibly disappointed by failure, where mistakes were not learning opportunities, where mistakes were evidence of inadequacy. The lesson that arrives from this environment is, if you are not going to do this correctly, do not do it at all. And so the adult does not do it, because doing it means risking imperfection. And imperfection carries the ancient emotional weight of disapproval from the people who mattered most. Let your breath be slow. Notice the quiet in the room. Jung would ask you to hold these childhood lessons with compassion, not accusation. The parents and teachers who delivered them were themselves carrying lessons from their own early experiences. The wounds that shaped your caution were not, in most cases, intentional. They were simply passed on, hand to hand, generation to generation, the accumulated strategies of people trying to survive in conditions that no longer exist. You are not being asked to condemn what was given. You are being asked to notice it, to see the ground you are standing on and understand that it was laid down in a different time, for a different set of circumstances, by a child who needed it and an adult who has perhaps needed it less and less. And understanding the ground is the beginning of learning to stand differently on it. This is not a quick process. The ground was laid down over years and decades, and it will not shift in a single evening. But understanding is not nothing. It is, in fact, the precondition for everything else. The person who does not know why they are cautious is at the mercy of that caution. It operates as if it were simply reality, as if careful, measured, waiting is just how things are, not a learned strategy with a specific history. The person who understands where the caution came from has something the other person does not: a choice, not a guaranteed freedom from the old learning, but the small, real, significant beginning of a choice. I can see this for what it is, and seeing it, I can ask whether it still serves me. That question, does this still serve me, is one the mind running on automatic cannot ask. It requires the ground to be visible. Tonight, perhaps it is a little more visible. Chapter 18, Emotional Pain Without Movement. There is a particular kind of suffering that Jung regarded as one of the most common presentations in his clinical work. It is not dramatic suffering, not acute crisis, not the sharp edge of immediate grief or terror. It is the suffering of someone who has lived with a difficulty for so long that it has become part of the landscape, who has in their way accepted the pain not because they have resolved it, but because they have stopped believing it can be resolved. He called this in various places neurotic suffering, not in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries now, but in its original clinical meaning, the suffering of someone who has not found a way to move through their difficulty and has instead organized their life around it. The person who has been unhappy in their work for 12 years, who mentions it with a shrug, with a practiced irony that has become its own kind of grief, who has considered and dismissed dozens of possible alternatives, who knows that something needs to change and has completely stopped believing that change is possible. They are not lazy, they are not weak. They are, in a very real sense, exhausted by the distance between knowing and doing. The emotional pain has become familiar. And the familiar, however uncomfortable, is something the psyche knows how to manage. What it does not know how to manage is the uncertainty that comes with moving. Because movement, real movement towards something different, means entering unfamiliar emotional territory. Territory where the old defenses may not work, where the old stories about yourself may not apply, where the outcome cannot be predicted with the weary certainty of someone who has been disappointed before and knows, at least, what that feels like. Familiar pain is predictable. New possibility is not, and the psyche, under sufficient accumulated stress, will often choose the known suffering over the unknown relief. This is not cynicism. It is one of the most human things about us. Think about the man who keeps running through every bill and obligation in his mind at 2 a.m. Not because the review will solve anything, not because any of the figures will change between midnight and dawn, but because the running through creates a sensation of control, of being on top of things, of not having missed something. The mind pretending to be useful because usefulness, even imaginary usefulness, feels safer than the alternative. And behind the list, if you follow it far enough, behind the bills and the obligations and the things that have not been done and the things that still need to be done, there is a simpler feeling, a sense of having not yet done enough to deserve rest, of being behind some schedule of a life that was supposed to look different by now. This is the unlived life making its nightly audit. Not viciously, not as punishment, simply noting, with the particular honesty of the late hour, the gap between the life being lived and the life that some part of you knows is possible. That gap is not a condemnation, it is an invitation. But the mind running its 2 a.m. review does not usually read it that way. The alternative is lying in the dark, still, with the full knowledge that there are things outside your control that you cannot plan or prepare or think your way around. That stillness is the one the overthinking mind most fears. Let your body be heavy for a moment. Let the breath move without any effort. Jung would say that emotional pain without movement is not a permanent state. It is a phase, a long phase sometimes, but a phase, and the movement out of it does not require the pain to disappear. It requires, first, the willingness to let the pain be felt clearly, not managed, not analyzed, felt, because what we understand but never feel cannot change us. What we feel, even briefly, even partially, can, and that feeling, that brief permission to be in contact with what has been kept at arm's length by all the analysis, that is where the movement begins. Chapter 19, Projection of Courage. Jung developed a concept that appears, once you have encountered it, absolutely everywhere. He called it projection. In its simplest form, projection is the mechanism by which something we cannot bear to see in ourselves gets placed outside the self and attributed to someone else. The person who cannot acknowledge their own anger will see aggression in everyone around them. The person who cannot acknowledge their own dishonesty will be surrounded, in their experience, by untrustworthy people. The emotion, the quality, the characteristic, too uncomfortable to own inside, gets projected onto the world. This applies not only to what we would call negative qualities, it applies in ways that matter enormously for the question of overthinking to positive ones too. The person who has not yet claimed their own courage will be very drawn to courageous people, will admire them with an intensity that carries the particular warmth of recognition. will study them, follow them, be inspired by them in a way that never quite translates into personal action, because the courage being admired is their own, projected outward, carried by someone else, lived vicariously. This is one of the quieter tragedies, Jung observed. People with enormous capacity who live that capacity entirely through others. The person with tremendous creative gifts who becomes the most devoted student, supporter, and audience for other people's creativity. The person with real intellectual power who devotes that power entirely to praising the intellectual work of others. They are not passive. They are active. They are doing something. Often something generous and warm and genuinely felt. But they are doing it outside the self, in the zone of safe admiration rather than personal expression. There is nothing wrong with admiring others. Admiration is honest and necessary. The question is whether the admiration is also serving as a substitute, whether the energy of what you most want to be is going outward, into the worship of others who are being it rather than inward, into the terrifying and necessary work of becoming it yourself. You may recognize something of yourself in this, the person whose name you hold in highest regard, the quality in them that moves you most deeply, the specific thing they do that makes you feel most intensely that you are watching something you care about. That quality, that specific thing, there is something in you that recognizes it from the inside. Not because you have read about it, because you carry it, and it is being admired in someone else because admiring it there is safer than claiming it here. Just breathe. Let the thought settle. Jung would not call this a flaw. He would call it a step. Projection, in his view, was not a mistake to be ashamed of, but an early stage of a process that, if followed honestly, leads toward integration, toward claiming back what you have projected. The first question is simply, what have you been placing in others that belongs to you? Sit with that. There is a particular kind of intensity in the admiration you feel for someone who is doing the thing you have not yet allowed yourself to do. It is different from ordinary admiration. It carries a quality that feels, if you look at it honestly, almost like longing, almost like grief. A recognition that is too warm, too specific, too personally felt to be simply aesthetic appreciation. This is the projected self recognizing itself in someone else. And the recognition, if you let it land rather than immediately redirecting it outward, is an extraordinary gift. Because it means the thing you have been admiring is not beyond you. It is not reserved for a special category of person to which you do not belong. It is yours. It has always been yours. You have simply been keeping it safely at a distance, admiring it in others where it cannot make demands of you, cannot expose you, cannot test whether you are actually capable of it. The admiration is honest. Now, let the honesty go a little deeper. The answer will not be comfortable, but it will be very useful. Chapter 20. The wound behind delay. Every pattern of persistent delay carries a wound, not a metaphor, not a vague reference to difficulty, A specific experience or series of experiences that taught the psyche something important and painful about what happens when you try and fail to reach something you need. Jung spent his career mapping these wounds, not to dramatize them, not to assign blame, but because he understood that the pattern and the wound are connected, that you cannot sustainably change the pattern without understanding what the pattern was formed to protect. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all of Jung's insights about delay. The delay is not the problem. The delay is the solution. The delay is what the psyche came up with when it encountered something that felt too dangerous to approach directly. The delay is the organism's intelligence doing its best work. The problem is that the intelligence is using old information, information that was accurate once and is no longer. Think about where delay learned its power. For many people, the wound at the center of chronic delay is a wound of early exposure, an early experience of trying, genuinely, effortfully trying, and having the result met with something that felt like contempt or indifference, or visible disappointment from someone whose opinion was everything. Not always dramatic. Often it is something small. A drawing held up proudly by a 6-year-old. A parent distracted or critical or simply not present enough in that moment. The child notes quickly and permanently, showing what I make can hurt. A teenager sharing an idea with a group met with laughter or dismissal. The lesson: voicing what I care about makes me vulnerable. An adult attempt at something that required real courage met with failure or rejection. The confirmation of everything the child already learned. Trying exposes you, and exposure costs. The wound is not the failure itself. The wound is what the failure meant about being seen. This distinction matters enormously because it changes where the healing needs to happen. If the wound were the failure itself, the healing would be straightforward. Achieve a success large enough to overwrite the failure. But most people who have tried this approach discover that success, even substantial success, does not quite reach the wound. The achievement happens at the surface level of the persona. The wound is deeper. The wound is in the place where you believed, for a moment or for years, that being seen in your imperfection and your genuine reaching meant something permanent and damaging about your worth. That belief is what needs to be revisited. Not argued with, not immediately countered with a list of contrary evidence, simply held very gently in the light of a different understanding, that being seen failing at something you cared about is not evidence of inadequacy, it is evidence of caring enough to try, of being human enough to not always succeed. The seeing and the caring and the trying are not the wound. They are the whole point. Most chronic delay is, at its core, a story about being seen. about what happens when the real self, not the competent persona, not the prepared professional, but the actual wanting, reaching, hoping self, steps forward and finds out how the world responds. The delay protects that self from that response. Let your breath settle. Feel the weight of your body. Here is the thing Jung knew that is harder to accept. The protection works. It genuinely works. The self that does not step forward cannot be hurt by the response, but it also cannot be reached by the response when the response is good, cannot be seen when being seen would be nourishing, cannot be met when being met would be everything. The wound behind delay is protecting you from something real, and it is protecting you from something you need. And tonight, sitting with that quietly is already a kind of meeting. A small, quiet meeting between you and the part of yourself you have been keeping safe. Chapter 21, Mental Health and Avoidance. Jung was careful throughout his career to distinguish between the ways a person could be mentally healthy while still struggling. He was not interested in a model of psychology that divided people into the well and the unwell. He was interested in the full range of the human psyche, including the ways that the normal, ordinary, undramatic navigation of a human life could become a source of quiet suffering. Avoidance is one of the most normal and at the same time most quietly damaging of all psychological strategies. Every person avoids. Every person has things they prefer not to feel, not to encounter, not to sit with. This is not pathology. It is the basic self-management of a complicated interior in a complicated world. The question is always the same. What is the cost of this particular avoidance, and can that cost be borne? For some people, the cost is manageable. They avoid the difficult conversation, the relationship absorbs it, they avoid the risky choice. Life continues comfortably enough. For others, the cost accumulates to the point where it begins to shape the entire landscape of the self, where the avoidance is so comprehensive, so persistent, that the life being lived is essentially a reduced version of the life that would be possible without it. A life built around the careful management of what must not be felt. And this, Jung observed, is where many intelligent, thoughtful, self-aware people find themselves after enough decades. They are not in crisis. They are functioning. They are, by many external measures, doing well. But there is a quality to the days that is hard to name, a flatness under the surface of ordinary satisfaction. A sense that the world they are moving through is a slightly thinner version of the world they could be inhabiting. This is the cost of sustained avoidance, not collapse, reduction. Here is what this can look like. A woman in her late 50s who has always described herself as a private person, who values her solitude, who fills her days with work and tasks and small pleasures that are genuinely pleasurable, who has not, in some years, had a conversation that felt truly close. She does not think of herself as lonely. She thinks of herself as self-sufficient. But at certain moments, usually in the evening, when the tasks are done and the solitude is complete, there is something that arrives, something that has the feeling of a question she has stopped asking. She does not call it loneliness. She has learned not to, but the body knows. Let your breath be easy. Let the room be quiet around you. The person who has organized their life around not feeling something they cannot quite name is not living a depleted life in any obvious way. They are active and engaged and, on many measures, doing well. But there is a quality missing that is very hard to name. Jung might have called it depth, the particular texture of a life that has fully met its own experience, including the difficult experience, rather than managed it from a careful distance. The life that has been truly inhabited rather than efficiently navigated. The difference is felt more than measured. It is felt in those specific moments when the quiet arrives and the management stops and something underneath looks back at you from the silence with a question it has been carrying for a long time. The question is not accusatory, it is just honest. Are we going to keep doing this? Or are we going to finally be here? Jung did not believe that avoidance could be overcome by willpower. He believed it responded to understanding, to the gradual, compassionate process of bringing into awareness what has been kept in the dark. You do not charge the thing you have been avoiding. You sit with it. You let yourself feel very carefully and very gently the edges of what you have been circling. And in that sitting, something begins to change. Not because you solved anything, because you stopped running away from it long enough to discover that it is smaller than the running felt. Chapter 22. The unconscious wants change. Here is the thing that changes everything. The part of you that is frozen, that is circling, that is waiting, that has been holding the pattern of delay in place for years, that part is not the whole of you. Below it, deeper, moves something else. Jung spent his life studying the unconscious, not as a dump site for what the mind rejected, but as a living, purposive, intelligent dimension of the psyche. He believed the unconscious was not passive. It was active. It was moving toward something. He called the direction it moved toward individuation. Individuation is Jung's word for the lifelong process of becoming, as fully as possible, who you actually are. Not who you were told to be, not who would be safest to be, not who would be most approved of, who you are at the deepest level, the particular configuration of gifts and wounds and inclinations and longings that is specifically and only you. The unconscious, Jung believed, is always pressing toward this, toward fuller expression, toward more complete existence. This is why the unlived life will not stay quiet. This is why the pattern of delay eventually becomes uncomfortable enough to notice. Eventually generates enough friction, enough restlessness, enough of that low hum we described at the beginning, eventually becomes loud enough to bring you, perhaps, to sit in the dark, listening to someone speak quietly about Jung and your own unfinished life. The unconscious wants change, not because change is always pleasant, not because the direction it wants to move is safe or comfortable, because it is in the nature of the living self to become a living system that is not moving toward greater expression of what it is not, in the Jungian sense, fully alive. This is not a judgment, it is a description. And if you feel that description landing somewhere real tonight, that landing is the unconscious making itself known. It has been patient with you, and it has been persistent. Let your body settle deeply. Let your breath slow. That quiet pressure you sometimes feel, that sense of something unfinished pressing against the inside of your ordinary days, is not dysfunction. It is direction. The unconscious does not speak in language. It speaks in images, in feelings, in the texture of your dissatisfaction, in the dreams you wake from with a sense that something important happened that you cannot quite hold. It has been speaking for a long time, and what it has been saying, in every way available to it, is this: there is more of you than this. You are being waited for by yourself. This is not a judgment. Let that be very clear. There is no transcript being kept, no final accounting in which the years of circling will be weighed against you. Jung had no interest in shame as a motivating force. He believed shame was one of the most reliable ways to guarantee that nothing changed. The person who is ashamed of their delay will often delay further, because movement under the weight of shame becomes associated with the exposure of the very thing they are ashamed of. The unconscious does not want your shame. It wants your attention. Simply that. A turning toward the interior with the same quality of honest curiosity you might bring to something you genuinely want to understand. Without the weight of self-judgment. Without the story about how long it has taken. Just. What is here? The unconscious has enormous reserves of patience. It will wait for decades if it must. It has been waiting through all the circling and all the preparation and all the almost, but not quite. But it does not stop pressing. And the pressure, understood for what it is not a burden. It is energy. Energy that has been accumulating for years, all of it pointed in the same direction. Toward you. Toward the more complete version of you that the individuation process has been quietly building, even through all the apparent stillness. The stillness was never complete. Something was always moving. Tonight, perhaps, that movement becomes a little more conscious, a little more chosen. Chapter 23, When Insight Becomes Escape. There is a paradox at the heart of the work we are doing tonight. Understanding yourself can become another form of not moving. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths in psychology. And Jung, to his credit, was not willing to avoid it simply because it complicated the case for his own discipline. He noticed again and again that the consultation room could become a very comfortable place to not change. Not because the insight being generated was wrong, but because insight in sufficient quantity and without translation into action, can begin to function as a sophisticated alternative to the life it is supposedly preparing you to live. The person who has spent 5 years in therapy, who can articulate every origin of every pattern with remarkable clarity, who understands their attachment style and their parental complexes and the specific shape of their psychological wound with enviable precision, and who has not, in 5 years, made a single significant change to the life those patterns are shaping. This is not a failure of the therapeutic process. It is a failure of translation, and it is far more common than the field likes to admit. Jung was also careful to turn this observation toward his own theoretical work. He understood that Jungian psychology, in particular, offered a rich and endlessly fascinating interior landscape to explore. Archetypes, the collective unconscious, the individuation process, the shadow, the anima and animus, an entire interior mythology that could occupy a brilliant mind for decades without ever requiring that mind to do a single thing differently in the world. He was wary of this. He said it directly: analysis is not a substitute for life. He wrote about his concern that the depth and richness of the psychological interior could become a world complete in itself. A world with its own satisfactions, its own progress, its own sense of deepening that never quite required contact with the outer life to sustain itself. The interior journey is real, and it is also sometimes a very long detour around the thing that most needs doing. And yet, the mind that is afraid to move will find any system sufficiently complex to explore. Philosophy, psychology, spirituality, any framework large enough to live inside, rich enough to keep the mind occupied, coherent enough to feel like progress. The exploration is real, the ideas are genuine. The interior life being cultivated is not nothing, but it is not the life. The life is out there, in contact with other people, in the mess and uncertainty and surprising grace of actual events, in the experience of doing the thing rather than thinking about the thing. Let your breath move slowly. Feel where your body is heavy. This is not an argument against understanding. Understanding is necessary and valuable and genuinely changes things. The question is, changed enough to move? Changed enough to take one step toward the thing you have been analyzing? Because there is a point in the process of self-understanding where more understanding is not what is needed, where the next step is not another insight, but a different kind of act entirely. A reaching out, a beginning, a risking of the known self in the direction of the unknown one. Jung called this the moment of encounter with the self, the deeper self, the fuller self, the self that cannot be reached through analysis alone. It can only be reached through living. And living, always, involves leaving the room where you have been safe. Chapter 24. The Fear of Becoming Real. We have arrived at the fear beneath the fears. Beneath the fear of failure, beneath the fear of judgment, beneath the fear of beginning and being exposed, there is something quieter and more fundamental. The fear of becoming real. Not real in the factual sense. You are already real, obviously. You exist. You breathe. You are here. But there is a kind of realness that comes only through full engagement with life, through allowing yourself to be tested, through putting the thing that you most care about into the world and finding out what happens. This kind of realness is a different order of existence from the comfortable, protected, potential-filled state of someone who is thinking about beginning. It carries weight, it has texture, it has marks on it, the marks of actual encounter with actual circumstance. And once you have it, you cannot go back to the smooth, unblemished state of pure possibility. This is the fear that many overthinkers carry without naming. The fear not of failure, but of transformation. Of the crossing that cannot be uncrossed, of becoming someone different from the person you have been and having to meet that difference without any guarantee of what you will find on the other side. We are accustomed to the self we carry. However uncomfortable certain aspects of it may be, it is known. We know its contours, its habits, its limitations, its reliable responses. We know, more or less, what to expect from it. The self that comes after a genuine act of courage, after a real risk, after the unlived life is finally entered, that self is not fully knowable in advance. And the ego, which needs to be in control, which needs to predict and prepare, finds this genuinely alarming. You can see this most clearly in people who are on the verge of something they have been circling for years. They have done the work, they have understood the pattern, they have, by every intellectual and emotional measure, prepared. They can feel the moment of action approaching. And in that approaching, they find not relief, but a particular, specific terror. Not the terror of what if it goes wrong, the terror of what if it goes right. And what if going right changes everything about who I am and what I do and what I expect from myself from this point forward? And what if I cannot meet that change? Becoming real requires leaving behind the person you were when you were safely waiting. Let your breath settle. Let the room be still. There is a story from a long time ago, from a very unlikely place. In 1849, a young Russian novelist named Fyodor Dostoevsky was led to a public square in St. Petersburg. He was 28 years old. He had been convicted of seditious activity and sentenced to death. He was taken to the square with other prisoners. He was prepared for execution. The rifles were raised, and then a messenger arrived. The sentence had been commuted. Dostoevsky did not go back to who he had been before the square. He could not. He had stood at the edge of not existing, and the experience had made everything that followed undeniably, irreversibly real. He later wrote that in those seconds he understood something that most people spend lifetimes trying to learn, that every moment is a gift, even the painful ones. That life, precisely because it ends, is worth living fully. Becoming real sometimes requires standing at an edge. Not the edge of death, but the edge of the self. the place where the protected, waiting version of you ends and the unknown, living version begins. That edge is not a cliff, it is a threshold. And on the other side of it, things become more vivid, more textured, more genuinely yours than they have been in a very long time. Chapter 25, Individuation requires action. We have arrived at the word Jung considered the most important in his entire vocabulary. Individuation. He defined it in various places as the process of becoming the particular, undivided self you most deeply are. The gradual realization across a whole lifetime of everything that is specifically and irreducibly you. Not the you that your family needed, not the you that your profession required, not the you that is safe or approved or legible to others. The you that exists beneath and behind all of these adaptive layers. The core self, the one that has always been there, waiting, often quietly, sometimes noisily, for the circumstances that would allow it fuller expression. Jung believed this process was not optional, not a luxury for the psychologically adventurous, a developmental imperative, as necessary to the human being as physical growth is to the body. And he believed, this is the part that matters most tonight, that individuation cannot happen in the imagination. It cannot be thought, it cannot be planned into existence, it cannot be achieved through insight, however deep, or understanding, however comprehensive. It requires encounter with other people, with difficulty, with the world's response to your actual self, with the experience of being in a real situation, making a real decision, discovering what you actually do when the theoretical becomes actual. Individuation, in short, requires action, and not action in the abstract or eventual sense, action that is specific and located in time. An act done in a particular moment, for a particular reason, with particular consequences that arrive in the real world rather than in the imagination. Every act of this kind, every moment in which you move from thinking to doing, from imagining to engaging, from potential to actual, is a step in the individuation process. Every such act tells you something about who you are, that no amount of self-reflection could tell you, because you cannot know how you respond to something until you respond. You cannot know who you are in a real situation until you are in it. And the person who spends a lifetime in the preparation stage, however rich and cultivated the interior life they build there, will reach the end of that life with a very clear understanding of who they intended to be and little experience of who they actually were. That is the quietest possible version of the unlived life. Let your body be easy. Let the breath move freely. Individuation does not require heroic action. It does not require dramatic change or public courage or any particular scale of achievement. It requires honesty of movement, one small act in the direction of what is actually true for you, then another, then another. The self that arrives through that accumulation is not the self you imagined. It is better in some ways and harder in others, and more specifically and precisely yours than anything the imagination could have constructed. And it is real. That realness is the whole point. Not the polished version, not the version that arrived having prepared thoroughly and succeeded with dignity. The real version, surprised by some of what it found, disappointed by some, changed in ways it did not expect, carrying the specific marks of specific encounters in a specific life. That self, with all its marks, is the one that Jung's entire life's work was pointing toward. The individuated self is not a perfected self. It is not a self that has worked through every complex and resolved every wound, and arrived at a state of crystalline psychological clarity. It is a self that has engaged with its own life honestly, that has stepped into the spaces that needed stepping into, that has met what was actually there, rather than what was hoped for, that has, in its imperfect and sufficient way, shown up. Jung was 85 when he said he was still astonished by how little he understood himself. The process does not end. The process is the point. It has always been the whole point. Chapter 26. Letting Go of Certainty. Here is perhaps the most direct of all the ways to say what we have been slowly building toward. Certainty is not available before you begin. It is simply not available. It does not exist in the place you are being asked to step. The ground ahead of you is real, but it cannot be seen clearly from where you are standing. The only way to know what it is like is to step onto it. And the mind that insists on certainty before movement, however understandable that insistence, however well-founded in old experience, is a mind that has committed to staying still. Jung wrote about this in his discussion of what he called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold two apparently opposing things, the known and the unknown, the safe and the necessary, the rational and the intuitive, without resolving them into a premature answer, to stay in the tension of not knowing long enough for something genuinely new to emerge. This capacity is, in practical terms, the ability to move without certainty, to take a step while still afraid, to begin before being ready, to act without knowing the outcome in advance. This is not recklessness. Jung was careful to distinguish between the transcendent function and impulsivity. The impulsive act bypasses the tension entirely. It does not hold the difficulty. It simply ignores it. The transcendent function holds the difficulty, feels it fully, and moves anyway. There is a kind of knowledge that is only accessible after the step, not before. Before, you can know the arguments for and against. You can know your feelings about the possibility. You can know what others have said about similar steps. After, you know what it is like for you, in your particular body, with your particular history, in your particular life. That knowing is the most important kind, and it is only available on the other side of the step. Think about a decision you have been circling for a long time. Notice how much energy has gone into the circling. The research, the reflection, the conversations, the returns to the question at odd moments of the day and night. Now notice, has any of that energy brought you measurably closer to knowing whether to step, or has it mostly brought you back to the same place, perhaps with slightly different language? This is the point at which certainty stops being available and movement becomes the only honest option. You cannot think your way to this ground. You can only step onto it. And here is what the step feels like from the inside, in the moments before it is taken. It feels like nothing is ready, like the conditions are still not quite right, like there is one more thing to consider, one more concern to address, one more version of the question to sit with. This feeling does not mean the step is wrong. It means the step is real. The steps that feel completely ready before they are taken are usually not the important ones. The important steps, the ones that are moving towards something that genuinely matters, always carry some residue of the not quite ready, always have a small portion of uncertainty that no amount of preparation was going to dissolve. That residue is not a warning. It is simply the feeling of standing at the edge of something real. Let your breath be slow. Let your hands rest open. Letting go of certainty is not defeat. It is not resignation. It is the mature understanding that the kind of knowing that matters most, the knowing that comes from having lived something rather than thought about it, requires giving up the safety of not knowing. And not knowing, held for long enough, is its own kind of prison. There is a thought experiment worth trying. Imagine you had been guaranteed by some impossible, absolute authority that the step you have been circling would work out. Not perfectly, not without difficulty or surprise, but that you would be glad 5 years from now that you took it. Notice what that guarantee would make possible in you. The ease with which you would then move, the sudden absence of the circling, the body simply moving toward the thing without the elaborate infrastructure of hesitation. That ease, that readiness, that willingness to move, it is available right now, without the guarantee, because the guarantee was never really what was needed. The guarantee was a story the mind was using to justify waiting. The movement is available without it, one that looks from the inside like prudence, and feels from the outside of your own life like a room you have been in for too long. Chapter 27. Small Acts of Inner Peace. Peace is a word that can mean many things. It can mean the absence of conflict, the end of disturbance, a state so quiet and resolved that nothing presses against you. But Jung was interested in a different kind of peace, one that does not require the difficult things to be absent, one that can coexist with uncertainty, with ongoing struggle, with the normal friction of a life fully engaged. He called it the peace that comes from relationship with the self, with the deeper, fuller dimension of who you are, that the individuation process is always moving toward. This peace is not calm. Not exactly. It has a different texture. It is the quality of being in right relationship with your own interior, of knowing, even when things are difficult, that you are moving in a direction that is honest, that you are not hiding from yourself, that the choices you are making, however imperfect, however uncertain, however partial, are yours. And small acts lead there. Not dramatic transformations, not the sudden achievement of the long-deferred goal. Small acts of honesty with yourself. Small steps in the direction of the thing you have been circling. The conversation that has needed to happen started. The page that has needed to be written begun. The door that has been standing closed for years opened just enough to see what light comes through. These small acts accumulate. This is the thing that is easy to miss, that the first small act does not need to accomplish the goal. It only needs to be honest. It only needs to be in the direction of the self rather than away from it. And the second honest step, and the third and the fifth, these do something to the interior that analysis and preparation cannot do. They change the relationship between you and the waiting. The waiting, once you have taken a step, is no longer the same waiting. It is less heavy, less fixed. It has become something with movement in it, with a direction, with the knowledge that it is temporary rather than permanent. And you, having taken the step, are slightly different from who you were before it. Not transformed, not resolved, just slightly more yourself. This is the only kind of peace that lasts. The peace that comes not from having arrived, but from moving, from being in honest motion toward the person you are becoming. Let your breath settle. Let your jaw soften. Here is the quiet truth that underlies everything we have been sitting with tonight. The mind that overthinks is not your enemy. It is a part of you that has been working very hard for a very long time at the wrong job. Its job was never to decide for you. It was never to protect you from all possible harm. It was never to achieve certainty before the step. Its job is to be present with you as you step, to think clearly about what has already happened, to make meaning from what the step revealed, to carry you through the difficulty with as much grace and intelligence as it can. That job the mind is very good at. Give it back the job it was made for. This is not a dramatic reassignment. It does not happen in a single decision. It happens gradually, incrementally, as you practice, day by day, decision by decision, the small act of moving before the thinking is complete. Not recklessly, not without any thought, with enough thought to establish direction, and then movement. And then the mind, now walking alongside the act rather than orbiting endlessly in front of it, does the thing it was always best at, making meaning from what is actually happening, finding the words for what the step revealed, understanding the pattern only available from inside the experience, building from the raw material of lived life, the genuine understanding that all the pre-analysis was attempting to construct in advance, the mind in service of the life, not the life in service of the mind, and take the first step yourself. Chapter 28. The Body Knows First. We have been speaking tonight almost entirely in the language of mind, thought, analysis, pattern, complex, insight. But there is something that precedes all of this. The body. Jung understood, and this was confirmed by generations of psychological research after him, that the body is not simply a vehicle for the thinking mind, it is a form of intelligence in its own right. A system that registers and processes experience at a speed and depth that conscious thought cannot match. When you stand on the edge of a real decision, the body has already responded. The quickening in the chest, the specific quality of tension in the shoulders, the way the stomach changes when you are moving towards something true versus away from something you are afraid of. These are not just symptoms of anxiety, they are information. The body knows, often before the mind has had time to form a position, whether a given direction is honest or not, whether an impulse toward action is alive or forced, whether what feels like fear is the fear of genuine danger or the fear of becoming who you are. The mind that overthinks has, in many cases, learned to override this information, to substitute the language of analysis for the language of the body, to file away the felt sense in favor of the argument, to move into the head and stay there where things are controllable and verbal and safe from the unpredictable intelligence of physical experience. But the body does not stop speaking just because the mind has stopped listening. It speaks in tension and tightness and the quality of the breath, in the way certain rooms feel and certain conversations leave your shoulders after they end. In the sensation, familiar to anyone who has spent long enough in a job or relationship or life that is not right for them, of a kind of background exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. Bessel van der Kolk, a Dutch-American psychiatrist who spent decades studying how difficult experience lives in the body, described it this way: the body keeps its own record in muscle and nerve and breath of everything we have lived through and everything we have not allowed ourselves to live. The body keeps score, and the body knows, often with remarkable precision, what the mind has been too careful to admit. Let your attention move downward now, from the words and ideas into the physical. Notice where your body feels heavy, where it holds tension, where the breath moves freely and where it catches slightly. There is information in all of that. Not a prescription, not a command, information. The particular quality of the tightness in your chest or your belly or your jaw, if you sit with it without immediately trying to interpret it or resolve it, has something specific to say about what has been held, about what has been waiting, about where the honest next step might be. Jung understood that the process of individuation was not merely a psychological process, it was a bodily one. The self that is becoming more fully real becomes more fully real in the body as well as the mind. And the first signal, almost always, comes from the body first. Before the mind has words for it, the body already knows. Listen. This is the underrated skill of the whole interior life. Not thinking about yourself, listening to yourself. The body's quiet, specific, patient report on what is true. Not what you have decided is true, not what you have argued yourself into believing, what is actually felt when the analysis falls away and the simplest question is asked, what do I actually want? What does this feel like in the body? Not the idea of it, the actual felt quality of it. That question, asked honestly and listened to with patience, tends to produce a very simple answer. An answer the mind already knew, has known for a long time, and has been circling in all its elegant complexity to avoid having to act on. Chapter 29. Why Purpose Frightens Us. There is something strange about purpose. Most people say they want it. They want to feel that what they do with their time matters, that their life is oriented towards something real, that the days add up to something rather than simply passing. And yet, when purpose makes itself genuinely available, when a direction becomes clear, when the path toward what actually matters comes into view, a particular kind of fear arrives. Not the fear of not finding purpose, the fear of having found it. Because purpose is demanding. It asks something specific of you. It makes a claim on your time and energy and willingness to be uncomfortable. It creates a standard against which your days can now be measured. Before you know what you are for, you can spend your time in any number of ways and call none of them wrong. After the purpose is clear, some ways of spending time become quietly and uncomfortably wrong. That accountability is genuinely frightening, particularly for someone who has built an interior life around the comfortable flexibility of not yet knowing. Jung wrote about this in his discussion of the second half of life. He observed that the first half of life is often necessarily occupied with building the structures of a life. Career, family, social identity, the external framework that provides security and belonging. The tasks of the first half are largely adaptive, becoming competent, becoming acceptable, becoming socially functional. But the second half of life, Jung believed, has a different task, and that task is precisely the one that purpose makes available, and that the mind so often resists. The second half of life is for becoming who you actually are, not who you built yourself to be, not who others needed you to be, the underlying self that was present all along, and that the busyness of the first half of life successfully drowned out. Purpose in the second half of life is the voice of that self speaking clearly enough to be heard. And the hearing of it, the genuine, unavoidable, honest hearing of it, comes with the weight of all the years during which it was not quite audible. The weight of, I have known this for a long time. The weight of, I could have started sooner. The weight of, how do I carry both the clarity and the lost years together? Let your breath be gentle. Let the weight of that be what it is. You are not being asked to forgive yourself quickly or completely. You are not being asked to make the lost years into something they were not. You are only being asked to hear the purpose now. That is all it has ever wanted, to be heard, to be followed. One step at a time, however late, however imperfect. And here is what is worth saying clearly about the weight of having waited a long time. The years you spent in the circling were not simply lost. The interior life you built during those years, the depth of your understanding, the careful observation of your own patterns, the accumulated knowledge of what does not work, all of this is not nothing. It is, in fact, substantial. The person who steps toward the unlived life at 55 is not the same person who would have stepped at 35. They bring more with them. More capacity for reflection on what the experience actually means. More patience with the difficulty of process. More ability to hold what is hard without being destroyed by it. The delay carried a cost. It also built something, and the something it built is what you carry into the first honest step, not as consolation, as truth. The direction is still available. The voice is still speaking. Chapter 30. The Soul Needs Friction. We have been speaking tonight with great gentleness, and that gentleness has been intentional. The overthinking mind does not respond well to aggression. It does not benefit from being shamed or challenged or pushed. It is already under significant internal pressure, and external pressure tends to drive it further inward, further into the circling. But gentleness is not the same as comfort, and there is something that needs to be said now, with care but without softening. Jung believed that the soul, and he used the word soul without necessarily religious intent, meaning roughly the deepest dimension of the person, requires friction to grow. Not crisis, not suffering for its own sake, but the particular kind of friction that comes from genuine encounter with difficulty, from doing the hard thing, from choosing the uncomfortable honest act over the comfortable dishonest one. He wrote about this in his concept of the transcendent function, that the growth of the psyche happens at the place of tension between opposites, between the known and the unknown, between the safe and the necessary, between the self you have been and the self you are becoming. Without that tension, without the genuine holding of what is difficult, the psyche does not grow. It stabilizes, it becomes efficient perhaps, it runs smoothly within its established range, but it does not become more. And a self that is not becoming more is, in Jung's framework, a self that is slowly, quietly dying. This is not dramatic. The process is very quiet. It looks from the outside like a life continuing normally. The days pass, the routines continue, the competencies are maintained. But something inside has gone still in a way that stillness should not mean. The friction the soul needs is not punishment. It is not suffering you seek out. It is simply the friction of moving toward what you have been avoiding. The friction of saying the true thing instead of the careful thing. The friction of beginning before you are ready. The friction of allowing yourself to be seen as you actually are, rather than as the persona you have carefully constructed. That friction is often uncomfortable in the moment, and then almost always followed by something that feels like release. Like coming back to yourself after a long time away. Let your breath slow. Let the quiet in the room be full. There is work ahead. Real work. The kind that cannot be done in the head. But it is not the punishing, crushing work of someone fighting against themselves. It is the friction of a real person, with real intentions, moving in a real direction, the friction of being alive. And that is a very different thing from the stagnant weight of the life held in suspension. Because the friction of genuine living, the friction of doing the hard thing, saying the true thing, taking the honest step, has a quality that the sustained weight of avoidance does not. The friction is specific. It belongs to a particular moment, a particular act, a particular encounter with real circumstance. It arrives and then it resolves. Something is learned, something changes. The next challenge, even if it is harder, is met with slightly more of yourself than the last one. Avoidance, by contrast, accumulates. Each deferred decision adds its weight to all the previously deferred decisions. The load does not resolve, it compounds, until the familiar heaviness of the not yet begun becomes simply the backdrop of the days, the grey light that everything else is seen in. The friction of movement is lighter than that grey. It is lighter than you think. Chapter 31, From Analysis to Courage. We have been mapping this territory for a long time tonight. The ego, the shadow, the complex, the unlived life, the wound behind the delay, the comfort of possibility, the projection of courage, the fear of becoming real. You have been given, in this long, quiet conversation, a fairly complete map of the interior landscape of the person who thinks deeply and moves cautiously. And now comes the question the map was always pointing toward. What do you do with a map? You use it to move, not to study indefinitely, not to add to the collection, not to appreciate the cartography, to find your way through the territory it describes. The move from analysis to courage is not a logical progression. You do not arrive at courage by thinking more carefully. Courage is not a conclusion you reach, it is a motion you make. Jung was very clear about this. He did not believe that insight automatically led to change. He believed that insight created the possibility of change, and that the change itself required something that insight could not supply. He called it, in different contexts, will. The capacity to act on the truth you have seen, to close the distance between understanding and doing. This is the work that cannot be done for you. By Jung, by this voice in the dark, by any teacher or book or framework. However rich, the step has to be taken by the person who needs to take it. But here is what is true about that step that you may not fully know yet. It does not have to be large. It does not have to be perfect. It does not have to be taken with full confidence or complete certainty or the blessing of everything you fear. It only has to be taken. One act, one sentence spoken that has been unspoken, one application submitted, one conversation started, one door opened that has been standing closed. One act in the direction of who you actually are. And then, and this is what the map does not always show clearly, after that act, you are in different territory. Not safer, not easier, but different. And in that different territory, the next step is visible in a way it could not be from where you were standing before. Let us stay with this for one more moment. There is a story from 1571 that belongs here. A man named Michel de Montaigne was 38 years old. He had lost his closest friend. His father had died. He had served in the public life of France and found it hollow. He retired to a stone tower on his family estate, had a motto inscribed on the beams of his study, "What do I know?" and began to write. Not about philosophy in the abstract, about himself, his particular, specific, ordinary, often embarrassing self. His fears and his contradictions and his small pleasures and his uncertainty about almost everything. He called these pieces essays, from the French for attempts, tries, not finished arguments, genuine attempts at understanding. He invented a literary form that has never gone out of use, because it is simply the form of a person thinking honestly on the page without knowing in advance where the thinking will lead. He took the first step before he understood what he was making. And what he made changed European literature permanently. The courage was always there, waiting in the complexity that had been projected outward into the people you most admired, waiting in the wound that protected you by keeping you still, waiting in the body that has always known before the mind was ready to follow. It has been yours all along. Let your breath settle. Let your hands rest open. From analysis to courage is not a long distance. It is one step, just one, and you have been circling the edge of it for long enough to know exactly where it is. Chapter 32. The Quiet First Step. Let us imagine it now. Not plan it, not analyze it, not outline the considerations for and against. Imagine it. The first step. The one that is actually yours. The one that is waiting for you after this night ends and the light comes back and the ordinary day begins again. It is probably smaller than you have made it. Most first steps are. The first step is rarely the launch of the entire enterprise. It is rarely the final conversation or the completed project or the full commitment. It is almost always something much more modest. An email, a phone call, a document opened, and a single true sentence written into it. A conversation started with the words you have been rehearsing for months, finally spoken in the actual room to the actual person. Something that takes 10 minutes or 10 seconds, and that, in its smallness, is somehow more terrifying than the larger imagined version. Because the smaller it is, the less excuse remains. A first step of enormous complexity is easy to postpone. Not yet. There is too much to prepare. A first step of quiet simplicity has nowhere to hide. You can do it now, or you can choose not to, and both of those things are available to you, and you will know which one you chose. There is a different kind of honesty in a first step that is small and within reach. It removes the story. Think for a moment about what your first step actually is. Not the eventual destination, not the entire arc of change you are trying to make. Just the next genuine, honest, specific move in a direction that is true. Maybe you have already known what it is for a long time. Maybe you have been calling it something else to avoid committing to it. Maybe it arrived with a specific feeling as I said the words, a tightening or a quickening or a small internal recognition that said, yes, that one. That recognition is enough. The body knew. Let your breath slow. Let the room be very quiet. The first step does not transform you, it just begins you. And beginning, actual beginning, the kind that happens in the real world and not just in the imagination, is the thing that everything else is waiting on. Everything that comes after it, the version of yourself that can only be known through engagement with actual life, the experience that cannot be imagined, only had, the answer that is only available after the step. All of it is waiting, and it is very patient. The first step, whatever yours specifically is, does not have to transform you. It only has to be genuine. It only has to come from the part of you that knows, rather than the part that is afraid. There is a difference in the quality of those two sources of action. The action that comes from fear has a slightly forced quality, a tension accompanying it. The action that comes from the self that knows has something else, a steadiness, an almost quiet sense of, yes, this is right. Not certain, not guaranteed, just right. You have felt that quality before. In moments when you were fully present and moving in an honest direction. That quality is available now. But you have made it wait long enough. Chapter 33. A life no longer deferred. Jung, near the end of his life, was asked what he had learned. He had written 30 volumes of collected works. He had treated thousands of patients. He had spent decades mapping the interior landscape of the human psyche with more care and originality than almost anyone before him. He might have summarized a theory, offered a synthesis, made a claim about the nature of the unconscious or the structure of the self. Instead, he said something quieter. He said, "I am astonished that I have become old and still know so little about myself." He was 85. This is not false modesty from a man who had lived and thought and written with extraordinary depth and seriousness. It is the honest statement of someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the self is not a finished project, that individuation is not something you complete, it is something you continue. The life no longer deferred is not a life of certainty or arrival. It is not the life where all the questions are answered and all the waiting is over. It is something simpler and more radical than that. It is a life in which you stop waiting to begin, in which the analysis serves the living rather than replacing it, in which the thinking comes after the step to help you understand what the step revealed rather than before the step, endlessly preventing it from being taken. This is a different relationship between thought and action, a more honest one, a more generative one. The mind that has been using all its energy to keep you still redirected finally to the project it was always better suited for, helping you understand and navigate what is actually happening in your actual life. That redirection is not a small change. It is the difference between a life in which you are the observer of your own potential and a life in which you are the inhabitant of your own experience. Think about someone in your life who seems to live this way. Not the person who is fearless or perfect or always certain, not the person who never doubts or hesitates, the person who moves, who tries the thing, finishes the thing, sends the message, starts the conversation, who makes genuine errors and acknowledges them without collapsing, who fails at some things and learns from the failure and tries something adjacent. The person whose life, even when it is difficult, has the quality of being fully inhabited. You admire something specific in them. You have been carrying that something for a long time. It is time to inhabit it yourself, not later, not when the conditions are better or the preparation is complete. Now, in whatever small and imperfect and sufficient form now makes available. That is the life no longer deferred. And it begins precisely where you are. Not at some improved future version of where you are, not once the circumstances are better or the obstacles have cleared or the timing has become more favorable. Precisely here, in this specific life, with these specific accumulated years, in this specific season, Jung was interested in the specific dream, the specific image, the specific feeling tone of a complex. Not the general category of experience, but the particular texture of this person's experience in this moment. The life no longer deferred is not a general improvement, it is something specific. A specific thing you have been avoiding for a specific reason, understood now with enough clarity that the avoiding is no longer fully unconscious, and the beginning, when it comes, will also be specific. A particular morning, a particular decision, a particular reaching out across the distance between who you have been and who you are becoming. You will recognize it when it arrives. Not because it will be dramatic, because it will feel, underneath the fear, like coming home to somewhere you have never been but have always known. Chapter 34. Rest after decision. There is a particular quality of rest that arrives after a real decision, not the uneasy pseudo-rest of someone who has postponed again, not the restless exhaustion of the person who has been circling the same material for the 100th time, The rest that comes after a genuine decision is a different thing entirely. It has a quality of settling, of the interior reorganizing itself around a new truth, as if the body, which has been bracing against the unknown future, can finally relax because the unknown is now, at least in direction, known. This is not peace through certainty. The decision may be uncertain. The outcome may still be completely unclear. The path ahead may be full of things that cannot be predicted, but the direction is chosen, and something in the organism that has been holding itself tense against the choosing can now release. Jung observed this release in the consulting room. The session in which a patient finally made a commitment, not necessarily to a specific outcome, but to a specific direction, had a different quality than the sessions of circling and analysis. There was a physical difference. The body was different. The breath was different. Something had come down from a high place of suspension and landed. And even if the landing was uncomfortable, even if the implications of the decision were genuinely difficult, the quality of inhabiting a real life, rather than hovering over a theoretical one, was recognized by the body as a form of relief. This is the rest tonight is pointing toward. Not the rest that comes from avoiding the decision, the rest that comes from having made it. And perhaps in the quiet of this evening, something has shifted in that direction. Not necessarily the full decision. The full decision may need a conversation, a morning, a particular moment of readiness. That is legitimate. But something has perhaps loosened. Some part of the circling has slowed. Some part of the interior that was held very tightly around the not choosing has perhaps very slightly let go. The decision does not need to be complete tonight. It only needs to be closer than it was this morning. That is enough. Let your body be heavy. Let your breath be slow. You have been carrying something for a long time, and the carrying is not yet over. But it is perhaps slightly different now, and slightly different is the beginning of everything. Jung lived this himself. The break with Freud, the years of interior wandering, the long dark before the Red Book, the slow rebuilding of an understanding that was genuinely his own, rather than borrowed or adapted from the man who had been his greatest influence. He had waited in the loosening for a long time before the loosening became movement. And then, when the movement came, it came not from certainty or preparation or readiness. It came from a willingness to take the next honest step without knowing where it led. That willingness is available tonight. It does not require the full decision. It only requires what has been building very quietly through this entire long conversation. And that something has been building, you can probably feel it. Not as resolve, exactly, not as a plan, as a very slight shift in the weight of things, a small loosening somewhere. The subtle difference between carrying something with every muscle clenched and carrying it with the muscles only half clenched, that difference is real. It is not transformation. It is not arrival. It is the very beginning of what eventually becomes both of those things. Jung spent decades helping people find exactly this, not the dramatic moment of change, but the first imperceptible loosening that precedes it. He believed these small shifts mattered more than the large gestures that followed them, because the shift happens at the level of the unconscious, at the level where the real shaping of a life occurs. Tonight, something shifted at that level, even slightly, even impermanently, even in a way that might be hard to hold on to by morning. It is enough. It is more than enough. The honest acknowledgement that something has been held too tightly, and that the hand, slowly, is beginning to open. Chapter 35. The Mind Softens. Let us pause here for a moment, not to meditate, not to fix anything, not to analyze another idea, just to notice your body has been holding you through this entire long night, breathing without instruction, keeping its quiet, faithful rhythms while the mind moved through Jung and shadow and complexity and the unlived life and the wound behind the delay. The body was here for all of it. It is still here. Let your attention move very gently to wherever your body feels heaviest right now. Your legs, maybe, your shoulders, the back of your head against what supports it. The specific pressure of your own weight resting in the dark. There is nothing to change. Just notice. Now think about the thought that has been circling most persistently tonight. Not necessarily the loudest one, the one that keeps coming back. The one that was present when we began and has moved through every chapter with you. The one that says, I know what I need to do. You do not need to act on it right now. You do not need to decide anything tonight. But instead of engaging with it, instead of arguing or planning or analyzing, just see it. Imagine placing it across the room from you, not discarding it, just creating a small distance. It is still there. You are here. Notice the space between you and the thought. In that space, something is calm. Something in you has always been calm, beneath the circling and the analysis and the ancient protections, beneath the ego's need to control and the shadow's accumulated weight, beneath the persona and the complex and the beautiful, elaborate delay. There is a part of you that is simply here, watching. That part has been watching all along. It did not need to circle because it already knew. It did not need to delay because it was not afraid. It has been patient with the parts of you that were. Let your breath find its own rhythm, not slower, not deeper, just its own. And for this moment, let the watching be enough. The mind that has been working so hard, for years perhaps, at the exhausting task of keeping you still, can rest. Not because the work is done, because tonight, in this long quiet, something was seen that changes the shape of the work. You are not broken. You were never broken. You were protecting something real in the only way available to you at the time. And now you have a wider set of tools, and the protection, slowly, gently, without drama, can become something else. Can become readiness, the real kind, the kind that does not wait for certainty, only for honesty. That honesty is already here. It has been here the whole time. Let your body be heavy. Let the breath come easily. You do not need to be anywhere else tonight. You are here, and here is enough. Chapter 36, Sleeping Beyond the Loop. And so we return to where we began. A quiet room, a mind that has been running all day and most of the evening, a body that is ready to rest, even if the mind has not quite agreed. The loop you came in with is still there, in its way. The pattern does not dissolve in a single night. The wound does not close in 3 hours. The unlived life does not suddenly burst into motion because you listen to someone speak quietly about Jung in the dark. But something is different, and the difference matters. What is different is that the loop has been seen, not just felt, not just endured, not just managed with another hour of late-night preparation for a future that keeps receding, but seen, understood for what it is, connected to something real about the shape of the interior, the architecture of the protection, the history of the wound. And what is seen in the dark can be remembered in the light. The work of the next days, of the coming weeks, will not be dramatic. It will not announce itself as the great turning point. It will be small and repeated and occasionally uncomfortable and often imperfect. But it will be movement, and the movement, one small, honest step at a time, is the beginning of the life that is no longer being deferred. For tonight, there is one invitation, not a task, not a plan, an invitation. On the first day, just notice. Tomorrow, sometime in the morning or the afternoon, when the habitual circling begins, when the mind returns to its loop, just notice it. Not with judgment, not with the intention to stop it, just there you are. That noticing is the whole of day one. On the second day, feel your body in it. When the circling arrives, before doing anything about it, bring your attention briefly to your body. Where is the tension? Where does the circling live in the physical? Just notice. On the third day, ask one gentle question. Not, how do I fix this? Ask, what would one small, honest step look like today? Not the big step, the small one, the one that is actually reachable. On the fourth day, let one thing be imperfect. One task, one communication, one attempt at something. Let it be finished before it is perfect. Let it leave your hands before it is ready. See what happens. On the fifth day, say the true thing once. In one moment of conversation or decision, the true thing rather than the careful thing, the honest thing rather than the approved thing, just once. On the sixth day, rest without earning it. For 10 minutes, stop the motion without replacing it with analysis. Not productivity in disguise, just rest. See what the mind does when you stop feeding it problems to solve. On the seventh day, return to a question. Sit quietly and ask yourself, what has been trying to live in me that I have not let live? Do not answer immediately. Sit with the question. Let the question be enough. These 7 days are not a program. They are not a solution. They are an invitation to begin the conversation between the mind that thinks and the self that needs to move. The conversation Jung spent his entire life facilitating. The conversation that is, ultimately, the most important one you will ever have. We close now the same way we began. In a quiet room, a body at rest. A mind that has moved through a great deal of territory tonight and arrived perhaps somewhere slightly new. Something has been seen that could not be unseen. Something has been felt that will not quite return to the unfelt place. And that is enough for tonight. Let your body be completely still. Let your breath move without any effort. Let the long loop of the evening slowly settle. The loop did not fail tonight. It brought you here, to this quiet, to this moment just before sleep, where something inside you is already moving. Not quickly, not dramatically, just moving in the direction of who you are. Let that be the last thought, and let it carry you gently, quietly, into the rest you have been earning all along. Sleep now.